water bottle.
Yeah, you're good. I'm going to also tweet this out.
Yeah, and I'll find that and retweet it as well.
I know it's on, it automatically goes out on the Compressed FM channel because we're streaming there, but I will retweet it. As much as I hate Twitter, it's like
it is
we
still
get, I know, and we still get a substantial amount of people that will tune in live.
Okay. Well, I'm not on Twitter, but if you post it on Blue Sky, I can repost it there.
Oh yeah, I'll do that. And props for you for cutting it off. I want to. I just have.
I mean, it is. I get it. Like for a podcast, you do need to be able to find people, and that's still where people are, which continues to baffle me. But it is just like that's everyone is there because everyone is there. There hasn't been the sort of enough of a momentum swing.
Okay. There's that. And I'll do this other one. Let's see. I think there's a few people that are lurking. Welcome. We are just sending out a few social media posts and then we'll get going. Cool. And this is, I am still holding out on ARC, even though it's basically dead.
Right.
But the one thing that's weird is sometimes when you open up a second window, because it syncs the two windows, it's like, oh, don't close that tab, even though it's in that window, because it'll sync and close the tab in the other window.
Oh, that's weird. So like if you have multiple windows that point to the same tab, closing it on one will close it on all.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't like that because that's like this, and it's my own disorganization, but I often have multiple windows with multiple things, and I just want to close this window, but keep if the same thing is open elsewhere. Yeah.
I mean, when you're streaming, it doesn't make sense. When you're doing other things like visiting different sites and stuff like that, it does make a little bit more sense, but okay. I'm just going to put out the Blue Sky one. Okay. Perfect. Got it. Okay.
And I will share it.
Awesome. If you're lurking around, welcome, but also feel free to drop any questions that you have for Josh in the chat, and I will try to answer them. Otherwise, actually, I'll give people a few more minutes since we just tweeted it out. Usually we'll have some kind of crazy topic to talk about. I do have some crazy topics that were not in the questions that I sent you that I do want to talk about. But we will... I'll save that spicy question for later.
I should also actually, sorry, before we get going, how do I sound? Because I have a microphone that's sort of awkwardly pointed at me. Okay, as long as I am audible,
you're great.
That's cool.
Yeah, you're great. And I'll also do post-processing on it, which makes people sound even better. So
perfect.
So my kids, I have 3 kids, 10, 9, and 7. And right now we've been into these would you rather questions. And they are quality. Like one of them, they found this book on Amazon that is Would You Rather You edition, where it's like all these really gross questions. Like, would you rather like blow worms out of your nose every time you blow your nose or eat someone else's earwax?
Oh my God. I think the earwax one sounds less, because like I don't want worms in my head. The earwax is gross, but it wouldn't be like I wouldn't be running to a doctor. So I'm going to go with that.
Yeah. Well, the thing that we kind of arrived at was like, actually, I think I messed it up. I think the original question was worms every time you sneeze. And so it was like, well, I don't sneeze all the time. So maybe that would be less obtrusive than eating earwax. Or like I could privately excuse myself if I have to go sneeze and then come back.
How often do you have to eat the earwax? I thought it was like a one-time thing.
That's a good question. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, one and done would be lovely. There are some other ones like, I'm not even going to remember all of them now, but it's like, would you rather have a foot growing out of your head or shoot eggs out of the palms of your hands? Like,
I mean, if you can control the eggs,
actually kind of cool.
Yeah, exactly. That's like free breakfast for life.
Yeah, I know, right? Well, and we were also talking like, do you get to control the types of eggs? Is it like omelets or, sunny side up? Or do you get to control what eggs? Is it like, dinosaur eggs or chicken eggs?
Right. It's fun. I actually, and I learned an egg thing recently, which is that penguin eggs, if you, like, what's the word where you put them in hot water and you boil it? Hard-boiled eggs. The yolk becomes transparent and it looks like kind of gross.
Oh,
it doesn't become white like chicken eggs do.
Oh, interesting. Today I learned. I'll have to share that with the kids. I have a friend that spent some time in the Philippines, and he was telling me that one of their like street food vendors that they have is like they sell these eggs, but the eggs are more developed, and so the chicken sometimes can be slightly formed in the egg.
No. I think I've seen that. Yeah, I would not like
that. He was like, he had spent the summer in the Philippines, and he was like, I was determined that by the end of the summer, like I at least wanted to try it just because it was so popular there. But I was like, I'm not sure if I could do that or not.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that, like everything, if you grew up with it, it's the most normal thing in the world. But like, I couldn't imagine adopting that at this point in my life. Like that's like a thing you have to be introduced to as a kid, I think.
Yeah. No, but I mean, I generally do like street vendor food. Like when I've been to Europe and I've done, I'm gonna mispronounce it, but it's called a doner or something like that. Where it's kind of like a gyro, but it's so good. I wish they had that in the States, or maybe they do. I just haven't found the right restaurants. But yeah, all that stuff's really good.
Totally.
Okay, well, we can go ahead and get started. I'm sure there will be more people that will kind of trickle in. Let me cue up the music. Okay. Awesome. What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Compressed FM, a podcast all about web design and development with a little bit of zest. In today's episode, we have Josh. Now, Josh is a very special guest because I have wanted to meet him for a very long time, followed his work. He is doing amazing things on the internet, so I'm excited to have him here today. Welcome, Josh.
I appreciate that. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Web development and design, who would have guessed? Well, we can do them both, even add a little zest. So turn up the volume, get ready for the best. Let's get it started in this episode of Compressed.
Sweet. Okay, so I sent you some questions before. We usually try and keep the conversation nice and casual, but you've done some things. Like I said, I've wanted to meet you for a while. You've done some things that I've really just wanted to ask you questions about. But first, maybe let's start with your background and your journey. So I know that you worked at Khan Academy and then Gatsby. So how did those experiences then lead you to becoming an independent course creator?
Yeah, so I'd always like been somewhat interested in education. Khan Academy was the first sort of professional step I took into that. And also around the same time, I started teaching at a local coding boot camp. So like actually, when I was at Khan Academy, it was a company in California, and I'm up here in Montreal. So I got an office at a WeWork, and in that same WeWork, there was a boot camp. And I sort of just started going, wandering by for the demo days and seeing what people would build. And it was always so much fun. So I started teaching there part-time in the evenings and on weekends. And through all of that, I realized, I really like this. It's pretty cool. And I saw other course creators sort of proving the concept for me, right? There was Wes Boss also up here in Canada. And like all sorts of people that were sort of doing this thing that I thought I would be pretty good at. But it wasn't until 2020 that I actually I had been blogging and sort of putting the pieces together. But in 2020, when the world was all shutting down, I developed a nerve injury that, and actually, Amy, we were talking about this just before.
Yeah.
That meant that for a few months, I couldn't really type or use a mouse. And so I developed like an alternative input mechanism where I had an eye tracker and dictation software. And those two things together could get you like most of the way there in terms of normal productivity, like maybe 50% of your output speed. But it was, it was a jarring enough experience that it made me realize, I don't actually have all the time in the world. Like if there's a thing I want to do, I should probably do it now because I know I can do it now, and I shouldn't take for granted that I'll be able to do it later. So that's what I did. I quit my job and I started building my first course, and I've been on that roller coaster ever since.
And we can talk a little bit more about the ups and downs of that roller coaster as we go. But one thing that I've always appreciated about your content and even your course material is you have a very distinctive, playful style. So how did you kind of develop this teaching approach? And how does that kind of reflect your learning preferences?
Yeah, I don't know that it was ever really that intentional. It was sort of just like, this is the way I would like to do it. The only intentional part was, and actually I sort of made this mistake a little bit when I first started blogging and with my first course, is I tried to adopt more of like a serious professional tone. I mean, very slightly, like by my standards. And I realized that like, who is that helping, right? Like, how is it beneficial? Really, I find that the things that are most memorable to me are things that are like a little bit quirky, a little bit strange. If I can make the content more, both like it's more relatable, right? It's easier to understand, more digestible. But also if it's like a little bit strange, that tends to help people remember the content, which is ultimately what I want people to do. So, yeah.
Yeah. To me, like, coding can be such a dry topic when you're talking about, algorithms or things like that. And so if there's ways that you can introduce whimsy into that, you're right. Not only does it make it more fun and memorable, but it also helps you stay engaged as the educator in creating things.
Yeah, I didn't want it to feel like a textbook. Like I wanted it to be more lively than that.
Yes, 100%. And I mean, like for the most part, when you think about use cases and how people actually use code and the things that they build, it's not always dry and boring. So like, I think about algorithms, it's like, that sounds complicated with math formulas and stuff like that. But when you start talking about like retention and digging into like social media and like how all that stuff affects those things, to me, that's when it starts to really get interesting.
Right. When it goes like from the theory to the practice.
Yeah, 100%. So is there a specific reason why you decided to focus on React and CSS?
Yeah. So in 2020, when I was first starting to go down this road, I came up with a list of like 5 or 6 things that I thought I could reasonably teach well. And I made like a pro-con list for each of them. And like, I forget exactly which course went on top, but in that process, I figured out that, CSS is obviously what I should do first, because it was the thing that I knew people struggled with. Like I knew so many other JavaScript developers that were like really good with JavaScript, understood HTML, and just had this big gap in their skill set that would really cause problems for them. Really, I was sort of in this boat myself going back a few years. And it was also something that, while it does take a very long time to get super proficient with CSS, if you give me like 10 hours, 15 hours, we can cover a lot of ground in that time. And I can really fill in a bunch of gaps and can make like a noticeable difference in how comfortable you are with the material Whereas with other topics, like if someone's been using JavaScript for 10 years, how much of a difference am I really going to make in the time that we have together in a course? Probably. I mean, I would hope it's still worthwhile, but it probably wouldn't be transformational in the same way that I thought I could manage with CSS. So once I had that realization, it's like, oh, obviously this is what I should start with. React was also something I knew I wanted to cover eventually, because it's the framework I've been using for a long time. I still think it's like one of the best ways to work. And when I was working for the bootcamp, I developed their React curriculum. So I had a lot of experience teaching React and seeing the failure of like coming up with an explanation and seeing a bunch of blank stares as you go over it. So it was it was almost like more of a practical consideration that like I knew I could do this well because I'd already done it. So that's sort of the rationale behind those two courses.
Yeah. Have you seen Joel Hooks in his case study for Matt Pocock's TypeScript course?
He's released a few things about that, and I've read some of them, but I don't know specifically.
Yeah, so I'll have to share that here. I'll share a link in the chat for it. But one of the things that, it follows exactly what you're talking about, how they develop workshops and get real-time feedback before then they take all this time developing a course. So it sounds like you did the exact same thing, but instead of streaming it, you actually saw faces and was able to get feedback. That's awesome.
Yeah, it is. This is like the big dilemma, and maybe the big mistake that a lot of course creators make is you assume that because you know something, you have a perfect idea of how to explain it. And like that idea almost never actually survives contact with people who don't know it. It never goes the way you expect it to go, right? So in my own courses, I've tried a few different ways to solve for that. What I do, like the main, I mean, I guess with the React course specifically, I did have this advantage of having taught it in person. But typically what I do is I create sort of an initial prototype, and it typically is pretty fleshed out, but it's still like not the final product. And I'll onboard like 50 to 100 people. So they're still taking the self-paced course. I'm not doing the same like workshop alternative, but I get a small group of people. They go through it. They tell me where they got stuck, what their confusion was. I send like surveys and stuff. And then I go back and, refilm videos if it's necessary or add clarifications, do all the things that will hopefully make the next person who takes it make their journey a lot smoother.
Sure. So how long does it take you to develop a course from start to finish?
Way too long. I've only done it twice, and I've been doing this for 4 or 5 years now. So in terms of like full-time work, it's usually about 1.5 years from when I start to when it gets released. Okay. And what I've done for the 2 courses, and I plan to do for my next course too, is giving myself a time deadline, like a deadline in terms of when I should finish it. And whatever I have at that point will be released as an early access product. And this actually gets back to like other ways to, I have that sort of test squad approach, which is a small group of people. Then I do the early access launch, which has typically been thousands of people. And I get a whole bunch more feedback from that, which I both use to go back and make further edits to things. Usually it's not so much like the same people hitting the same walls of confusion, because hopefully at that point I've solved for those. It's more like, this exercise doesn't work well on Windows, or there's like some like edge cases that I have to deal with, or just like, some people get stuck on specific word choices. It tends to be like smaller edits at that point. Goodness, I have wandered down a road and I forget what question I was answering.
Well, we were talking about how long it takes. So also just like your whole process for developing those courses.
Right. Yes. So it takes 1.5 years, and I typically spend like 6 to 8 months on the first version, and then a few months after that, the full version comes out.
Yeah. One thing, so I did buy your Joy of React course, and I bought it not because of the content. I mean, I did buy it because of the content, but not because of the content. I bought it because I was mostly interested in how you built your platform. And I just wanted to see how all of that works. And so one of the things that was interesting to me, you blogged about this, where you're talking about using, I think, the sandbox code to create these interactive elements.
Sandpack. Yep.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about some of the other unique interactive demos and exercises?
Yeah. So, and if people have seen my blog, they'll be familiar with this. I always find that the best way to explain something, or the best way to understand something, is to be able to fiddle with it, like to be given some sort of like literally a sandbox, not like a code sandbox, but literally like an environment where you can poke and prod at things. And so for my blog, that means that like when I'm covering CSS transforms, rather than like having a paragraph that says like, the translate property moves it left and right, or even having a video that shows the thing moving left and right, I'll give you a box with a slider, and you drag the slider and it changes a little snippet and moves the box around. And there's something about that interaction of like actually getting to physically move the thing that I find makes the material stick a lot better than trying to visualize it in your mind from text or even seeing it on a screen in a video. So that's like the core concept, like the main idea that I wanted to, and the reason I built my own course platform was for this, was so that I didn't have any restrictions. I could build content without there being like a strict boundary between like, okay, this is the content and this is the code base, right? There isn't the same like where I'm limited to the handful of elements that you get in Markdown. I can build little custom widgets and drop them anywhere in the course. So that was sort of the core idea behind it. And Sandpack, which is what I use for the code playgrounds, has been a super helpful part of that too, because they give you all the like hard stuff, like the bundling and the live previewing, the hot reloading, all of that comes in, but then you can build whatever UI you want on top of that. So I've added a bunch of like, like for the React course, there's a button you can click to enable or disable strict mode, which really just like edits the code in the background. But like stuff like that is super fun because I can take this sort of annoying detail and abstract it away and give you a button instead of having to like tell you to like go and find the original, the root node and add React.strict mode around it or whatever.
Yeah. So how do you come up with these ideas for these different elements? Do you just think, oh, I need a topic for this particular, like a widget for this particular thing? Or are you like, I have this widget idea, I want to use it to talk about a particular topic? Like which comes first?
Yeah, it's typically that I'll be like, so the way that I start is I have an outline and I have like, I'll break down the course into a sequence of modules and then a modules into a sequence of lessons. And for a given lesson, it's typically like it becomes obvious to me where like if this was initially going to be a video, but I find I'm like gesticulating too much or like having a hard time putting something into words, that's usually a sign that like, oh, there's a better way to cover this topic. So usually it just becomes kind of obvious just from the difficulty I have covering it. And that's not entirely like sometimes it is like I'll be in the shower and I'll have an idea for the perfect way to visualize some concept. And so I'll rush and like write that down. And then that becomes the sort of the seed for a lesson that blooms beyond that. So it kind of happens in a number of ways, but typically it is a matter of like, it's just, this is the best way I can think of to cover this thing. So that's what I should do.
Sure. Now you mentioned that you're using Markdown, you're dropping in widgets. What are some of the other tech stack pieces that you have for making your own course platform?
So specifically MDX, which is like a superset of Markdown. That is like absolutely critical because that's what gives me the ability to create standalone React components and just drop them in wherever. Other than that, like I use Next.js for my course platform, but I don't think that's required. Like you could very well succeed like with a lot of the tech choices I make, right? MDX is one of the things that I think, no, you actually need that because there aren't a lot of alternatives to that. But everything else is like, any JavaScript framework would be fine. I use MongoDB as the database, but SQL would probably be a better choice. It's more just like this was the easiest way I could get up and running. So there's not like a lot that I find is absolutely critical. But yeah, the tech stack right now is Next.js. I'm still using styled components, despite the fact that now they are in maintenance mode. Yeah. I'll probably stick with that for a few more years because I just really like it.
Sure.
And yeah, MDX, Next.js. That's kind of the general idea.
Are you using the app router or the pages router? Because I know
still on Pages.
It's been around for a while, right? Okay.
Yeah. Well, so this is, I generally try to have both because I have two main projects. I have my course platform and my blog. With the blog, I did actually update it. So the blog is using app router and I'm using Linearia for styling because you avoid the whole, every component has to be a client component if you use style components.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So Linearia has been great, but I struggle to recommend it because it's super niche. Like very few people actually use it. And there's like some rough edges that just have, it's a small project that doesn't really make sense for like most organizations to use, but it was perfect for me. Like it has really been the right solution for me. But yeah. So, and that was sort of the plan was I was going to take my blog, move it to App Router, and then sort of see how I felt about it and maybe update the course platform. And it's been like a really mixed bag where some things are like super cool and nice. Other things, like I didn't really get any sort of performance benefit. In fact, the performance of my blog got slightly worse moving from Pages to app. So, really? Like I wasn't in a huge, well, it's complicated. There's like the way they handle CSS modules, which is what Linearia compiles to, involves putting a bunch more CSS in your initial payload. And they justify this, not unreasonably, that if you're going to be navigating around, it's sort of better to pay that cost upfront so that you're not constantly loading a bunch of duplicate styles, because if you split it out by route, a bunch of those CSS files are going to have the same thing, which like makes sense for a dashboard. But for a blog where most people come from a search result and may only visit that one page, it's not the right trade-off for me. And the other, you know, the pages router did sort of work where style components would get loaded as needed for every page. So like it's, you know, there's trade-offs, and I think that there are all of the decisions that they made are reasonable. It's just that for like the sort of thing that I do, really, now that I think about it, the course platform actually would be a better example of like, you know, that's something where people do go through many different pages. But ultimately, it made me realize that, you know, the pages router isn't going anywhere. They haven't officially deprecated it. And I like it. Like, I feel like a lot of the, like, they show you the, like, here's the before, where things were sort of strange. Like, you had this weird get server-side props method, and now it's just part of the function. And like, yeah, that's the new way feels better, but the old way didn't feel bad. Like, I'm still super happy with the pages router. So I'm not in a rush. I figure I'll stick with it until it stops being feasible.
Now, are you hosted on Vercel?
I am, yes.
Okay, because I know there's benefits. So this was kind of the spicy take that I was curious to see what you thought. So I don't know if it feels recent just because it's been in a few conversations that I've had recently, but it's kind of this ongoing conversation with Next of, if you really want to get all the benefits of Next, you really should host on Vercel. And so there's other hosting platforms that are a little grumpy about it just because it's like, well, it's open source. You should make this available. But at least in my mind, I'm like, they made it, like, and it is open source, but they don't owe you anything. Like, that's part of their business model. But it also seems there's been conversations online of people that have said, is React Server Components really worth it? Is this just something that like Next and Meta concocted, but like, do we really need it? And some of like, I've even wondered, just kind of my own take on this is it their excuse to not implement it, or just to create this narrative of it's too hard, so we're not, and the old patterns are still better? Like, do you have an opinion about that?
Yeah, so I do think like, and I don't know the full depth of this, so I should preface that by saying I'm going off of a couple of blog posts I read. But as I understand it, there is sort of a general pattern that most frameworks use, which is the idea of adapters, where like, you know, there are certain hook points that you can create so that the core concept, right, the core structure is portable, and you can sort of build alternative adapters for Netlify or for self-hosting on whatever, right, on your own VPS. And the challenge is that a bunch of the way Next.js works is it hooks into like invisible things that are behind Vercel's sort of curtain. And I do think that like, if you're going to advertise that like you can run this code anywhere, and like Vercel as a company provides an option, but it's just one of many options, as like many of their marketing materials suggest, then you do sort of have an obligation to like make that true. And it shouldn't require a team of engineers working full time to be able to create a reasonable alternative. So I do think there is like some impetus is the word that comes to mind for Vercel to like, and I think they are. I saw that they posted something about how they're going to start working towards that adapter approach, which I think is great. I do think that they do have some responsibility to do that. But you're right too. Like, it's their product; they can structure it however they want. And this is sort of a quibble I've had with Vercel generally, is that there's a bit of a gap between their marketing materials and reality. Like when the app router came out, they made it stable a few months in, and it did not feel stable. Like if you tried using it, it still felt like beta software. It was great, but it felt like there were still a lot of rough edges to be sanded down. But you wouldn't know that from reading their press releases about it.
Right.
But yeah, I should also at this point mention I have been sponsored by Vercel. You wouldn't know it from the way that I'm talking, but they were covering my hosting costs for a long time. I think they stopped a couple of months ago. But
okay.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, I love Vercel. They've sponsored my stuff as well. And they've also been a sponsor of the podcast. So it is interesting, just the things that people develop opinions around.
Yep.
Okay. Oh, so one thing that I wanted to ask you about, we're kind of going back to creating your course content, is how do you find the balance between what level of advancement the content should be? Like, do hit a point and you're like, oh, this is too advanced? Or do you say like, oh, these people should already know this coming into my course?
It is really challenging. And this is something I have sort of struggled with, because that is often the case, right? Like I can either create a lesson that explains all the fundamentals that, like, if you're coming to this with more experience, will be a bunch of stuff you have to sort of slog through. But I also I also want to cover the more advanced stuff. And I only learned somewhat recently, like I had sort of assumed based on the questions that I get in our community Discord that most people who take my courses are relatively new. Like maybe they just graduated from a boot camp, maybe they're a few months in. A lot of the questions I answer are like pretty junior level questions. But I sent a survey to everyone that had purchased one of my courses, and something like 75% of survey respondents had like 5+ years of professional experience. So there was that mismatch where most of the people who take my courses don't show up in the community Discord because they're at a level where they don't really have the same level of questions. So there is like, and it's true, like something like 20,000 people have registered for my courses. I've interacted with like maybe a few hundred of them in my Discord. So I only get a small sample. And that sample, as it turns out, isn't representative. So that's something I've been sort of keeping in mind with my new courses, that I should sort of meet people where they are at, which is a more advanced level. And one of the ways that I'm trying to solve for that, and I did this in the React course too, is I created like reference modules. Like I had the JavaScript primer, which was sort of intended for people that either were new to JavaScript or had like old JavaScript. Like they were comfortable with ES5, but they hadn't touched any of the stuff that has been coming out in the past few years. And I think that actually worked really well, because in my main content, I could say like, okay, you know, we're going to take for granted here that you understand how implicit returns work in arrow functions. But if you don't, here's a link to a lesson that explains that. And that way it's like an optional side path that people can take.
Sure.
So that is something I want to start doing more. That sort of is the best way I've found to have your cake and eat it too, where you can then pitch the course to a pretty wide audience, because you know that for earlier people, references exist. For later people, they won't have to go through a bunch of stuff they already know.
Yeah. Man, that's so interesting to think like the people that were the loudest are the ones that are maybe the beginners, but it's also a tinier subset of the greater whole.
And it does make sense. Like people who are more advanced aren't going to run into as many questions, because they're going to know they already know the answers to the questions they would be asking. But yeah, it was shocking to me. In fact, I sent that survey had like a bunch of questions, and every single question was the opposite. Like the answers were, another question I had was like, are you all paying for this yourself, or is your employer reimbursing you? And I figured it was like a 50-50 mix, but no, like 80-something% of people are paying for it out of pocket. It turns out that very few people, even though most people who take my courses are working as full-time developers and have been for a long time, I suppose there aren't the education budgets that I've been lucky enough to have at my various employers. That's not as common as I thought it was.
So with the content, I guess let's start with CSS. What are some of the biggest misconceptions that people have had about CSS that you're like, if you could just understand this mental model, I feel like a lot of other things would click for you?
Yeah, the biggest thing is, and this was something that I realized myself, that I can speak to this because I had this epiphany. I used to think of CSS as just a giant collection of properties. And if you could just learn what all the properties did, you would understand the language. The way I see it now is that CSS is a collection of layout algorithms. So you have the sort of normal natural flow. Then you have flexbox and grid and positioned layout. And they're all sort of like their own little worlds. And each of these worlds, each of these layout algorithms can decide how to implement each of the properties. So like, you know, justify content is a property that doesn't exist in most layout modes. Actually, it's coming to, they're like retroactively adopting it in Flow layout. But when it was introduced, it was specific to Flexbox, and then also with Grid. But every property is like this, like the width property, right? If you set width 1,000 pixels, that doesn't mean one thing. It means something very different if you use it in Flexbox versus in normal Flow, like in Flow layout. Because in Flow layout, width 1,000 pixels is like a hard constraint. Like you're going to get an element that takes up that space. In Flexbox, that's like the beginning, right? That's like the hypothetical size before we start adding the constraints in. And if the container is only 600 pixels wide, it's going to make that element flexible. It's going to shrink down to fit in its container. So that's like the big thing, is that CSS is not, as I thought it was, just this big collection of properties. And if you really want to understand it, you have to understand how the properties work in the context of these layout algorithms, that the properties are actually inputs to these functions, and the functions take those inputs and decide what UI to produce as outputs.
Yep. I think two big things when I've taught CSS stuff that I think has made a big difference is things like positioning is relative. So it's like, yes, I am applying all these styles to this particular element, but when the browser is determining how to apply those things, it's also looking at the parent element.
Yeah.
So it might not respond the way that you think it does just because the parent element doesn't have a class of relative, or it's absolute or fixed or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah. This is, I think, what causes so much frustration is everything in CSS is related. So like, and you're exactly right. You like for a long time, I would have these go-to snippets, right? I would have these things, whether I copy paste them literally or just have them memorized. And the most frustrating experience you can have in CSS is when you have one of these trusty snippets and it's done the exact same thing the first 50 times you use it. And on the 51st, my box is on the other side of the page, and there's no like console log. There's no way to debug that. And it always is because of one of these things. Like maybe 15 levels up, you added overflow hidden, and that property is breaking this thing that you have down here, right? My position sticky isn't working because I've accidentally created a scroll container when I added an overflow property 15 levels higher in the tree. So there's a lot of stuff like that does reasonably confuse people. But once you understand those limitations, and this is something I really try to like in my CSS course, we go over all of the weird rules that I could find that I know of. Because if you can understand those weird rules, you'll stop having those unfortunate days where surprises catch you off guard.
Yes. Well, and I think Tailwind has resolved a lot of this in terms of specificity, but that's been another thing, is trying to figure out how that scoring works to know what one rule rules them all without using important.
Yeah, I think that there's, and this is, I think we've been so like spoiled for choice in terms of the ecosystem, because it's true that the old way of writing CSS was you had so many different selectors, and trying to figure out which of these selectors wins in every given situation is super difficult. As we started moving to components, this has sort of worked itself out, where as long as you have, like in my own projects, I have two kinds of styles. I have my global styles, which are typically like either like my CSS reset that sets a bunch of like baseline properties globally, or like tag specific styles. Like maybe I know that I want all links on the page to have a certain style. Then you have your component styles. And as long as you use tag rules for your global styles and class rules for your component styles, you never have to worry, because like the classes will always overrule the tags. And then as long as you don't like create compound selectors where you're mixing in some IDs or having, specific like ancestor descender classes, you can avoid a lot of the specificity challenges just with the right mental model. And yeah, Tailwind is great because it doesn't give you an option. Like you have to do it. Everything is just classes. But a lot of tools work that way nowadays too. A lot of CSS and JS is the same thing, where it's still all classes, but those classes are abstracted. So if you use something like style components, every style component you create is really just a class. But by not giving you the option to structure it otherwise, it sort of takes care of that for you.
Is your CSS for JavaScript developers, is that using style components?
It is, yeah.
Okay.
Which
are you going to rework that?
Probably not, or at least not for a while. Lots of people have asked if I could either migrate the course to Tailwind or add a Tailwind module, which is an entirely reasonable request. I just don't use it personally, and I feel like it's I can't think of a faster road to burnout than like forcing myself to learn and teach technology that I'm not like enthusiastic about. Which my feelings have warmed on Tailwind, but it's still not something I want to use just in my own projects. So it does feel like I probably should at some point migrate to something else. But the counterpoint is that most of my CSS course, even though it is showing CSS in the context of JavaScript frameworks, the JavaScript framework isn't really the point. Like 80% of the material is focused on CSS mechanics. And in fact, even most of the exercises don't use style components or anything else. A lot of the time I'm using a plain CSS file because we're talking about CSS concepts, and that's the most direct way. So other than one module in my CSS course, which is on component architecture, where we do dig into some of the details of style components, most of the course is focused on plain CSS.
Yeah. Well, and style components looks like CSS when you're writing it. But I think my unsolicited advice would also be just to keep it as it is, because it is easier to use Tailwind after you understand CSS. because that's all Tailwind is CSS. And I feel like
Yeah.
a lot of times people that get confused with Tailwind or it doesn't work the way that they expect it to is because they don't truly understand the CSS underneath. So
And that
it's more
is
important that you learn that core concept first.
that is like the core. One of the core things I try to cover in the course is that no matter what tool you use, the browser only understands CSS. So like everything else, you have all these like layers of abstraction that can help you write it. All of that stuff gets compiled away. And the thing that runs in the browser is CSS. So if you understand sort of the inner mechanisms of CSS, it'll be relatively easy to learn how to use any tooling that comes along.
Yep.
So that's been my go-to answer for people who want to use Tailwind who ask me about the course, because I do think it'll still help you a lot. It won't cover Tailwind, but it'll give you all the stuff you need to know in order to use Tailwind effectively.
Sure. Yeah, 100%. So let me ask a similar question now for JavaScript. What are some common misconceptions JavaScript? Wait, I think I said that backwards. Let me rephrase this. As React has evolved, what fundamental concepts do you think remain essential for people to understand? Or like, what are some of the mental models that they need to hang on to?
I mean, I think that React has changed a lot in the past couple of years in terms of moving more to a full stack, like actually having a full stack answer rather than that being left to meta frameworks. But it's still sort of like, this is another thing too. People ask me if I've updated my course for React 19. And I never know how to answer that because we don't cover the new features like actions or the related APIs like use optimistic. But everything we cover in the course is still like totally relevant. Like I went through the course and made sure that any references to things that had changed, like the removal of forward ref, things like that are covered. But like fundamentally, the framework hasn't actually changed that much. Like server components are a big new thing as well. But the core idea of like you have some state, that state is used to describe some UI with JSX, that JSX is then reconciled with whatever came before. We figure out what updates need to happen to the DOM, and those updates are propagated. That core loop hasn't really changed. And I do think like this, and it'll be interesting to see because we're going on like year 2 now of this existing as a concept, right? Server components and this whole thing. I haven't seen the sort of adoption that I saw with hooks, where a couple years in, very few people were using class components. And it makes sense because there's a lot more buy-in required. Like you need to have a certain bundler, you need to have a certain framework. So it'll be interesting to see which React sort of wins out in the end, like whether it does become mostly used by full stack developers who have really bought into this vision of a full stack React, or if we see like people continue to use it with Vue and treating it as a single page application with the full stack stuff being more of like a niche specialization. But either way, you still need to understand the concepts that React has been using since a long time ago. So I think that most of your time learning, like most of the stuff you learn will be the same. And a lot of the newer things are sort of nice to haves that you can bolt on top. Like actions are cool, but you don't like, as far as I know, and I've only experimented with actions a little bit, I don't think that they solve all of your use cases for all event handling and form submissions. Like if you're doing something that is purely client side, I haven't found any advantage to doing it with actions. So I think that there's still very little that has become redundant or made obsolete. It's more that you have these additional nice to haves.
Yeah. Well, and the things like, I think this is true. I haven't tried in Remix. Well, they have their own way of handling forms. I was going to say the stuff that you cover in your course applies to all frameworks right now. When you start getting into some of the React 19 features, not all of those have been adopted across the board. So it almost creates more problems than it is helpful.
And that is something I had to deal with. That when I was updating the course, my initial plan was to remove lessons on things like forward ref because you don't need them anymore. But then how many people are actually using React 19? So what I did instead is I kept the lesson, but I added a note at the top that says like, hey, if you're using React 19, this lesson has been, fixed. They've addressed the concern that made this lesson required. But if you're still using React 18 or earlier, here's the content as originally presented.
Yeah, that's a good point. Because I mean, even if you'll have people that have greenfield projects that can use the latest and greatest, but then how many legacy projects are people having to support where that really is an issue and a topic or concern that they need to keep in mind?
Totally.
So how do you stay up to date with all these new features and everything coming out?
Yeah, the answer is that I don't. Like, I'm not. I think that, like, for most people, like, I don't know if you know Adam Argyle. He's a CSS
Yeah.
developer. He's like every new thing, he's created demos for it. He's enthusiastic about it.
Yeah.
And most of the things he shares, I'm like, oh, that's neat. I had no idea that was a thing. So, like I'd say I have an average level of awareness when it comes to new stuff. So I see, like, when container queries started getting implemented in browsers, I saw people like Adam share demos. And at that point, I started taking an interest. But, like, compared to most, like, and I probably should, this is probably like a problem that I should address. I tend to wait for things to reach a certain critical mass before, even like actions, right? I haven't taken the time to fully understand actions because I'm waiting to see if the community broadly embraces them or if it does turn out to be more of a niche thing. And this is something I do think that people get really stressed about, like, trying to always be fully up to date. Whereas, like, things do change quickly, but most things take a while to fully kind of rise to the awareness of the community. And many things never get there. So my philosophy has always been, like, wait until things have truly caught on. Because otherwise you're going to spend a lot of time learning things that never really get fully realized.
Right. Or I want the APIs to settle before I invest time.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, that's especially true for, like, creating courses. That's
right.
It's always, it feels like you're walking on a tightrope when you're, like, I did this for when I was building my React course server components, and Next 15 or 14, whichever one introduced the app router, that was in beta. And it was like, okay, I need to create this material now, but how much of this is going to change? How much work am I creating for myself in the future? And fortunately, it wasn't that bad. Like, the beta API was relatively consistent. But yeah, that is a concern.
Right. Or like with CSS, checking the can I use, because it's like, I could put this on a site, but if people aren't going to see it and it's not going to be supported, you're creating more work with that at supports and trying to write double code for people that can see it and people that can't.
Yeah.
So you mentioned a couple of times that you have a new course. Can you talk about it?
Yeah, I'm super excited to talk about it. My third course is going to be all about whimsical animations. And this is actually, I had started, initially this was going to be my second course. So when I finished the CSS course, it felt like a natural extension. But what I realized as I started building it was some of the demos I wanted to create really benefit from using a JavaScript framework. And I wanted to cover it in that context. And then I thought, well, if I know I want to have a React course eventually, I should cover, like, the prerequisites, or I should create the courses in the order that it would make the most sense to take them. Because if people take a course that requires React as, like, a fundamental, and then I create a React course after that, everyone that's on the second course, like the animations course, wouldn't benefit from it. Now, this turned out to be a little bit of a wrong assumption, because as I've been revisiting the animation course, I realized actually most of this stuff doesn't need a JavaScript framework. And so my plan now is we're going to cover everything using basic web technologies. And then I'm going to have additional content. It's just like, oh, if you use a framework like React or Vue, here's how you would adopt these ideas to that. So my initial strategy there was actually kind of flawed, but that was always sort of what I wanted to do. I think this is the course that is the most on brand for me. The thing where I think, like, there are plenty of CSS courses and plenty of React courses. There aren't really any courses that cover, like, the niche animation stuff that I like to do. I mean, there are some. There are definitely some, like, there's really good SVG courses out there, for example, but nothing that covers it from the angle of, like, let's figure out how to put faces on things and have those faces respond to your cursor. So it's been so much fun getting to, like, truly indulge in this stuff. I've been working on it now for probably 3-4 months. Although really it's been mixed with other stuff. And my hope is to launch it in early access. Again, I'm doing my thing where I give myself a deadline. September of this year is my hope to get that out the door, with, like, some percentage of the entire course completed, with the full course coming sometime in the first half of next year.
Okay. Now, are you using, like, CSS animations, Framer Motion?
The current plan is that we're going to cover the first modules on particle effects, and that's just, like, straight up regular DOM node CSS and vanilla JavaScript. We are going to probably do some work with Framer Motion in one of the later modules, because it is super cool. We're also going to cover SVG, because SVGs are really handy, and probably 2D Canvas as well. So we're not going to touch like Three.js, because that could be a course on its own. But we're going to look at 2D Canvas, because you can do a bunch of really cool things with that. And so that's the general structure of the course. Is going to be probably 5 or 6 modules that each look at a different sort of genre of effect. So the first module is on particles. We're going to have one on SVG. probably one on scroll effects, like scrolly telling is the cute word I've heard described for this, where you have like a narrative story that is told with scrolling.
Mm-hmm. Jay does a lot of that stuff. Do you follow him on Twitter or Blue Sky? Jay Tompkins.
Oh, yes.
He
yes.
works at Vercel. He used to work with Adam.
Yeah, he does a bunch of really cool stuff.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. One of my favorite conference talks was one that he did where he just was like, these are all the cool things you can do now in the browser, and had all these fun, whimsical animations and demos and stuff like that.
Nice.
So, actually, as a side note, one of the cool things that he did in his presentation, I've never seen it done before, and it's been something I wanted to steal, but I've just never done, is at the beginning of his presentation for his conference talk, he handed out party poppers, like you pull and confetti goes everywhere. And so it's like, as you see something that you like, pull your party popper and it'll explode. And so like
that is
his
really
entire
cool.
talk, there was just like this really high energy level because all these people were popping their party poppers in the middle of his talk, which is fun.
That is really fun. I feel like I would want to like check with the venue and see like how much work am I creating for their janitorial staff with this confetti everywhere. But I guess they probably like, I've been to conferences where there are like, Smashing Conf does tend to like have everyone blow up their own balloon. So you wind up with like hundreds of balloons. So I guess that's already something the conferences like they recognize as part of the deal.
Sure. Well, he was also the closing talk for that day. So it wasn't like anybody came into a bunch of trash at the end of his talk.
Right.
Cool. Well, that's exciting. I can't wait to see more information about that. Are you doing anything with GreenSock?
Probably not. And again, this is like, it's a very cool looking tool, but I haven't really found myself, like I've experimented with it a little bit.
Sure.
But I try to stick with the stuff that I'm already using so that I can teach what I know.
Right. Well, you can all do so much. One with CSS animations, but also Framer Motion. Like I was even doing something the other day where I was trying to do drag and drop and understand the API, and Framer Motion even has that functionality, at least from a base level, built into it. So it really is amazing what Matt's been able to create.
Totally. Yeah. And that's like, and drag and drop is a good example of something that you could build yourself, but would be like really, really difficult to get all the like edge cases and deal with browser support and all of the like normal restrictions that make stuff like this hard. I find that there's like two categories of animation library. There's the ones that exist to wrap around the existing APIs, but make them a little bit nicer to work with. And I generally have like less interest in those. Like if it gives me the same capabilities, but with maybe a nicer abstraction, there's nothing bad about that. That can still be useful. But in my mind, it's like, why would I add an abstraction when it doesn't give me any new capabilities? Whereas Framer Motion gives you so much stuff. Like the big thing is layout animation, right? So the idea is you have maybe the DOM in a certain order, and then the DOM itself changes. So like your list items get reordered, or maybe like, you change the height of an element, which causes a bunch of other elements to move around, not because their CSS has changed, but because the layout has changed. Framer Motion makes it super easy to animate those things, which is, it doesn't sound like much, but having built my own little library that tried to do that, it is incredibly difficult, especially when you start talking about interrupts. Like what should happen if you change something so things start moving, but then you change it back. There's so many, you can spend your whole career trying to solve those problems. And it's remarkable that Framer Motion has solved many of them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even to your point in terms of abstraction, that kind of goes back to the Tailwind conversation. It's like Tailwind is really just abstracting CSS.
Right.
It's important to know what those core concepts are if you're going to use them.
Totally.
Cool. Is there anything that you want to talk about that I did not ask you about before we go into the next segment?
I don't think so. I appreciate you giving me the chance to plug my course.
Yeah, of course.
No, I think we covered a bunch of cool stuff.
Well, and I mean, as I mentioned, I bought the Joy of React course, not because I didn't know React, but because I wanted just to see your course platform, which I think really, says something to anybody that's on the fence. It's amazing, all the little pieces that you've built into it. It's worth just going through the content and looking at all those, if anything else. But
I appreciate that.
I think it's also interesting that I'm kind of going back to this, but talking about intermediate to advanced developers buying it is, I think the benefit to a lot of these courses is even if you already know React, is being able to fill in the gaps. Because sometimes it's like I've picked up a piece here, picked up a piece there, but just trying to have a solid understanding and make sure that those gaps are filled. Your course does a great job of doing that.
I appreciate that. And actually, this is something I meant to say earlier. Part of why I started teaching in the first place was I realized very quickly that it's like a cheat code for developing your own understanding. Like when I worked at the boot camp, you would get questions from people. Like, and actually, one of my blog posts that I wrote a couple of years ago was about the difference between a statement and an expression in JavaScript. And I made this post because a student at the boot camp asked me, because we were talking about statements, and he's like, "Hey, so I've heard there's expressions too. What exactly are those?" And I opened my mouth to answer because like I know exactly what those things are, only to realize that like, no, actually, I have no idea. Like, I know how to use JavaScript because I've sort of, I felt my way around it for enough years that I understand sort of intuitively what the limits are. Like you can't put a for loop in the middle of your JSX because that's a statement and that's an expression slot. But in terms of like what they are, like how do you define either of those things? So I had to like puzzle through it and like look at the specification and figure out exactly like, okay, this is how this is defined. And this is like concretely what the limits are rather than just what I've discovered through experimentation. So it is, I find, a really helpful technique for building your own intuition is to try to explain stuff to other people.
Yeah. I worked at a consultancy for a while and we partnered with a boot camp in California. It was in San Diego. And their motto was, this is James's motto, but learn, build, teach is the same thing. They had a different way of wording it. But basically, they required all their students to first learn it and then teach it. Because as you said, it's when you teach it that you really solidify that knowledge and you can understand where your gaps are when you're trying to explain it. So it's a huge hack. Or not hack, but tip. Okay, so we will go into the next segment of the show, which is our picks and plugs section, where we pick something that we like and we plug something that generally that we've worked on. But anyways, do you have any picks and plugs for us?
Yeah, so for picks, I'm going to go with the science fiction series I've been reading recently, which is called Dungeon Crawler Carl by Matt Dinniman.
Okay.
It's like a really fun, and I recognize these are pretty niche recommendations, but more than any other science fiction that I've read in the past few years, other than maybe Becky Chambers, it's been a series that I found myself I couldn't put down once I started it. So I'm on like book 5 now, and it's a lot of fun. It's good fun. So that's my pick. My plug will be what we've already talked about, which is my whimsical animations course, which you can learn more about by going to whimsy.joshwcuomo.com. And actually, that landing page, I spent several weeks building it, even though there's virtually no information on it. Because my probably too clever by half idea was rather than like tell you what the course is about, I'm going to add a bunch of these like whimsical details to the course. And if you want to know how to build this webpage, the course will cover that. So there's a bunch of little details. There's a control toolbar that I call the chaos toolbar in the top right that allows you to manipulate the page in a number of ways. And that's, cool. If you want to know how I did that, we'll cover a bunch of that stuff in the course.
Oh my goodness, this is amazing. I have not seen this. Okay, so I'm going to include... Let's stick the link in the chat. It is worth, whether you intend to buy the course or not, it is worth going to the website and playing with it. Oh, this is awesome. And I love the sound effects. I just did the palm. Oh man, I'm going to have to go back and play with that. That's amazing. Sweet.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. So I'm going to pick, oh man. There's a game that I just started playing. So I have Apple Arcade mainly for my children, but it's called, let me make sure I get the full name right. Should have checked this before. It's called, I think that's what it's called. Well, on my phone, it shows up as Saw Blades Plus. I'm pretty sure it's like Chance of Saw Blades is the full name of it if you go to the Apple Arcade. But it is one of those like tiny little addictive games. Yeah, A Slight Chance of Saw Blades is what it's called in the Apple Store. But it's one of those little addictive games that doesn't take long to play. And I'm not very good at it. But my son and I have been competing on who can have the best score. But basically, you're this little character. Saw blades fall from the top of the screen and you have to jump over them. So it feels a little bit like Flappy Bird in the sense that it's really hard to get a good score. My highest score is 18, which I'm sure somebody could easily beat, but my son's highest is 30. So that's the one that I'm going for. So
Nice.
check that out if you just want fun to play or fun to play with your kids. So it's been fun to kind of talk smack with him and try and get better on the game. And then for my plug, I am going to plug, it's probably premature, which is fine. It's still kind of in preview. It is still in preview mode. But so I'm on the Redwood JS core team. We just released Redwood SDK. So if you go to redwoodjs.com, you can find a link over to it, or you can go to rwsdk.com, and I'll include a link to this. But basically, over the last couple years, we've been working to get React Server components running within Redwood. And so we have decided to rebuild everything. So before it was heavily tied to GraphQL, and now it's a Vite plugin that is kind of married to Cloudflare. So you get all the benefits of all the Cloudflare services, which is pretty incredible, everything that they offer with AI and storage and all the things. So check it out. Again, it's in preview mode, but I will be creating quite a bit of content around that and React Server components and React 19 stuff. So kind of fun.
That's super cool. I've been like sort of waiting for other frameworks to adopt. I know like Parcel has as well.
Yeah.
But that's exciting.
Yeah, it's also, man, just really cool being kind of tying to Cloudflare, another alternative to Vercel, but just all the services that they offer. Like I really had no idea everything that they offered until we started going down this path. So,
Nice.
And they just had their Cloudflare day this week, actually, where they announced and launched a bunch of stuff. So yeah, really cool. Awesome. Well, thanks, Josh. It has been a pleasure. Like I said, this is a conversation I've wanted to have for a long time, and it did not disappoint. So thank you for spending the time with me today.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me. This has been great.
Yeah. Sweet. Well, if you are listening in your podcatcher of choice, please leave a rating and review. That's how other people find the show. Now we get great guests and sponsors. For now, that's all we got. That's funny. I've said that so many times and I've never gotten tongue-tied. It seems like it would be on automatic. Okay, so thanks everybody for hanging out in the stream. I'm going to go ahead and end it, but happy Wednesday.
Bye, everyone.